My mother said I didn't belong at that table. She didn't whisper it. She said it 2 weeks before Christmas, standing in her own kitchen, while I was still holding my coat. Cassandra, you made your choices. Don't expect to be treated like someone who contributed. I didn't argue. I set my keys on the counter and asked if she needed help with anything. She didn't answer. What my mother did not know, what none of them knew, was that a deed had been sitting quietly in my name for 18 months, and the key my grandfather was about to place in my hand at Christmas dinner was going to open a door that changed everything. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And hit like and subscribe if you have ever been made to feel invisible by the very people who were supposed to see you. My name is Cassandra Parker. I am 32 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was the wrong kind of Parker. That is not self-pity. That is just the architecture of my family, and I understood it early. The Parker family ran a mid-sized real estate development company out of West Hartford, Connecticut, Parker Group. My father, Richard, had built it from a small property management firm into something with 16 employees, 2 commercial projects a year, and enough revenue to keep my mother, Diane, in a lifestyle she considered her natural right. There was a house with 6 bedrooms in a neighborhood where every lawn looked like it had been ironed. There were charity galas and country club memberships, and a family name that meant something in Hartford County. At least to the people who cared about that kind of thing. My brother Brandon cared. Brandon was 36, 4 years older than me, and he had walked straight from his MBA program into a desk at Parker Group without a single detour. He wore the right suits. He said the right things at the right dinners. He called my father sir, in front of clients, and my mother kissed his cheek every time he walked into a room like he had just returned from war. Brandon was the future of the Parker family. Everyone said so, including Brandon. I had taken a different road. I studied architecture at UConn, graduated with honors, which my mother mentioned exactly once and then never again. I worked 2 years at a firm in Hartford doing commercial interiors, learned everything I could, and then left to go freelance. That decision, that single decision, reclassified me permanently in my mother's mind. I went from daughter to cautionary tale overnight. Diane Parker did not understand freelance. To her, freelance meant failed. It meant you couldn't keep a real job. It meant you sat at home in your pajamas and pretended to work while the rest of the world moved forward without you. The fact that I was booking clients within 3 months, that I had built a small but steady portfolio of residential and boutique commercial projects, that I paid my own rent on a 1 bedroom in Wethersfield without asking anyone for anything, none of that registered. What registered was that I had walked away from a salaried position with benefits. That was the unforgivable part. My father was quieter about his disappointment, which almost made it worse. Richard Parker expressed disapproval through absence. He stopped asking about my work sometime around my 28th birthday. When the family gathered, he talked to Brandon about zoning regulations and contractor bids. And he talked to me about the weather and whether I was eating enough. It was a very polite form of erasure. And then there was my grandfather. Henry Parker was 84 years old and lived alone in a farmhouse in Simsbury, about 40 minutes northwest of Hartford. He had retired from Parker Group 15 years earlier, handed operations to my father, and more or less disappeared from the family's daily conversation. He was mentioned at holidays and occasionally referenced when my father wanted to invoke legacy, but no one visited him much. The drive felt long. He didn't have Wi-Fi. He went to bed at 8:30. I visited him every 4 to 6 weeks. I started going after my grandmother passed 6 years ago. The first time I drove out, I told myself it was just to check on him, make sure he was eating, make sure the house wasn't falling apart. But I kept going back because Henry Parker was, without question, the most interesting person in my family. He had opinions about architecture that surprised me. He had lived through things. He asked me questions about my work and actually listened to the answers, not just waiting for his turn to speak. He had a dry humor that caught me off guard every time. He told stories about building his first property in 1971 with a $6,000 loan and a handshake. I fixed his back porch screen door one October afternoon. I repainted his kitchen cabinets the following spring. I reorganized his study when his knees made it hard for him to reach the lower shelves. I brought him coffee from the place in Simsbury he liked. The dark roast, he said, tasted like the 1980s. He always had the same thing ready for me when I arrived. a plate of shortbread cookies from a tin he kept on the counter, and a chair already pulled out at the kitchen table. My mother knew I visited him. She didn't ask about it. I don't think she found it interesting enough to question. That was her first mistake. The dynamic in our family had been established so long ago that no one thought to examine it anymore. Brandon was investment, Cassandra was liability. Brandon's choices were celebrated, Cassandra's were tolerated at best and mocked at worst. I had stopped expecting fairness by the time I was 25. What I had not stopped expecting was basic decency. A chair at the table. My name said without a sigh attached to it. I didn't always get that either, but I kept showing up. To the holiday dinners I wasn't technically excluded from, but wasn't warmly invited to. To the family events where my mother introduced Brandon to her friends 3 times, and me once, briefly, as our other one. I showed up because Henry was there, and because somewhere in me, I still believed that families were capable of surprising you. I was right about that, as it turned out. Just not in the way I expected. By the time that Christmas arrived, things between me and my parents had gotten worse. There had been a Thanksgiving. There had been a phone call about a document I was supposed to sign. There had been a text from Brandon that I did not respond to. The distance between me and the rest of the Parkers had grown wide enough that I had genuinely considered not going to Christmas dinner at all. But my grandfather had called me on December 10th, his voice thinner than I remembered, and asked me to come. So I came. The Thanksgiving that broke something permanent happened on a Thursday in late November, 27 days before Christmas. My mother had set the table for 14. The good china, the kind she only brought out twice a year, white with a thin gold rim that she had inherited from her own mother and treated with more tenderness than she treated most people. There were 2 centerpieces, fresh eucalyptus and cream-colored candles, and place cards written in her handwriting, which meant she had decided in advance exactly where everyone would sit and what the evening would look like before a single person walked through the door. She had seated me at the far end of the table, next to my Uncle Gerald's wife, Patricia, who was lovely but talked exclusively about her Peloton and her golden retriever. I found my card, moved it 1 inch to the right, so I wasn't directly under the draft from the window, and went to pour myself a glass of water. Dinner was fine for the first hour. Turkey, green beans, the sweet potato casserole with the marshmallows on top that my father requested every year without fail. Brandon arrived late, which he always did, and when he walked in my mother stood up from her chair. She actually stood up, crossed the room and hugged him like he had been away at sea. He had driven 40 minutes from his condo in West Hartford. I watched this from the kitchen doorway and felt nothing in particular. I had watched this dynamic my entire life. It no longer had the power to sting the way it once had. Or so I told myself. The announcement came during dessert. My father tapped his fork against his water glass, the way he did when he had something to say, and the table quieted. He was a man who commanded rooms without raising his voice. I will give him that. He had a stillness to him that people read as authority. He talked about Parker Group. He talked about growth. He used phrases like next chapter and long-term vision and the right hands, and then he said Brandon's name. He said Brandon would be stepping into the role of VP of Development, effective January 1st, that he would be overseeing all new acquisitions going forward, that this had been a long time coming and the family should raise a glass. 14 people raised their glasses. 14 people said Brandon's name in a warm collective murmur. My mother was crying, actual tears, the good kind she saved for moments she wanted to remember. I raised my glass too. I am not a person who makes scenes, but something moved through me at that table. Not jealousy. I had never wanted a desk at Parker Group. What moved through me was something older and more specific. It was the recognition that in this room, in this family, I would always be the person the toast was not for. I could walk in carrying something extraordinary, and my mother would still find a way to hand the centerpiece to Brandon. After the toast, my aunt leaned over and asked me what I was working on lately. I started to answer. I had just finished a boutique hotel lobby in Middletown, actually, my best project to date, and my mother's voice cut across the table from 6 seats away. Cassandra does interiors, she said to no one in particular and everyone at once. The way she said it made interiors sound like a hobby, like something you did to keep busy between real accomplishments. I finished my sentence anyway. My aunt nodded politely. The table moved on. Later, in the kitchen, I was rinsing plates. My mother came in to check on the coffee. We were alone for the first time all evening, and there was a moment, brief, the length of a breath, where I thought she might say something real. Something that acknowledged the announcement, or asked how I was, or simply existed in the same register as honesty. Instead, she opened the cabinet, took down the coffee filters, and said without looking at me, "You made your choice when you quit. I hope you understand that. I turned off the tap. I didn't quit," I said. I changed direction. Same result. She measured the coffee with the little scoop she kept in the canister. "Brandon has been with your father for 8 years. He earned this." "I know he did," I said. "I'm not arguing with you about Brandon." "Then what are you arguing about?" I looked at her profile. The careful makeup, the pearl earrings, the set of her jaw that I had inherited and always resented because it meant my face sometimes looked like hers when I was angry. I thought about telling her that I wasn't arguing about anything, that I was tired of a room where I was always the afterthought, that it would cost her nothing to once, just once, ask about the hotel lobby in Middletown. I didn't say any of that. I folded the dish towel over the handle of the oven and said, "I'll see you at Christmas, Mom," she said. Which was her version of goodbye when she had already moved on in her head. I got my coat from the closet by the front door. I found my grandfather sitting in the armchair by the fireplace in the living room, away from the rest of the family, a small glass of bourbon on the side table. He looked up when I stopped beside him. "Leaving?" he said. "Early morning tomorrow," I said. He nodded slowly. He had the kind of eyes that had seen enough of the world that they didn't need to be wide to take things in. He reached out and put one hand briefly over mine, where it rested on the back of his chair. He didn't say anything, he didn't need to. I drove home on the highway with the heat on high and the radio off. The roads were mostly empty. It was 9:43 at night, and the exit signs glowed green in the dark, and I thought about my grandfather's hand over mine, and what it meant that the only person in that house who had acknowledged me was 84 years old and said it without words. I thought about the document my mother had mentioned, the one her lawyer had apparently drawn up, the one she said I should expect in my email by the end of the week. I hadn't seen it yet. She had described it as a formality, something to do with simplifying estate arrangements down the line. I remember thinking, I should read that carefully. I did not yet know how right I was. The email arrived on a Monday, 4 days after Thanksgiving, at 11:17 in the morning. I was sitting at my drafting table in my apartment, working on a set of material samples for a residential project in Glastonbury. A young couple renovating a Victorian. The kind of job I loved because the bones of the house were good and the clients trusted me. I had 3 fabric swatches pinned to the board and a cup of coffee going cold on the corner of the desk when my phone buzzed with the notification. The subject line said, "Parker Family Estate Planning, Document for Review." The sender was not my mother. It was someone named Jeffrey Marsh, attorney at law, with a firm address on Asylum Street in downtown Hartford. I put down the fabric swatch. The email was brief and professional. Mr. Marsh explained that he represented Richard and Diane Parker in matters of estate planning, and that enclosed was a document they had asked him to forward for my signature. He said it was straightforward, designed to simplify the distribution process for Parker Group assets in the future, and that if I had questions, I was welcome to call his office. He used the word straightforward twice in 4 sentences, which I noted. I opened the attachment. It was 11 pages. I read all 11 of them. I am not a lawyer, but I had signed enough contracts in my freelance work to know how to read one slowly and without assumption. I made myself go through every paragraph. The language was dense in the way legal language is designed to be dense. Not to clarify, but to exhaust. To make you feel that understanding it fully would require more energy than it was worth. So you might as well just sign on the last page and hand it back. What the document said, translated out of its careful phrasing, was this. By signing, I would formally disclaim any interest in Parker Group assets, current and future, including any properties, holdings, or financial instruments held under the Parker Family Trust. In exchange, I would receive a one-time payment of $15,000 upon the death of either Richard or Diane Parker. Whichever came first, $15,000. For everything. I sat with that number for a while. I turned it over. I thought about what it represented, not just financially, but as a statement of what my parents believed I was worth in relation to this family. $15,000 and a clean signature, and then I would be legally, permanently outside the circle. I closed the attachment. I did not call Jeffrey Marsh. I did not call my mother. I opened a new browser tab and spent 40 minutes researching estate attorneys in Hartford County who did not work for my parents. I found one. Her name was Claire Oduya, and her office was in Farmington. Her reviews mentioned that she was thorough and did not rush clients. I called and made an appointment for the following Wednesday. Then I went back to my fabric swatches and my Victorian house in Glastonbury because I had a job to do and clients who were counting on me, and I had learned a long time ago that the way I survived my family was to keep building things that were mine. The appointment with Claire Oduya was useful. She read the document while I sat across from her, and when she looked up, her expression was neutral in the professional way that told me she had an opinion she was organizing carefully. She said what I had understood. This was a full disclaimer of inheritance rights. She said the $15,000 figure was unusually low for an estate of Parker Group's size. She said I was under no obligation to sign anything, and that doing so would be permanent and irrevocable. I told her I had no intention of signing. She nodded and said good. I called my mother that evening. Not to discuss the document. I had decided not to do that yet, but because my grandfather had left a message on my phone that afternoon saying he was having some trouble with his furnace and asking if I knew anyone who could look at it. I called my mother to ask if she had followed up with him. She had not known the furnace was having problems. She said she would have Richard call someone. Her tone suggested this was being added to a list. I said I would drive out to Simsbury the following weekend and check on him myself. There was a pause. My mother said, "You really don't need to do that, Cassandra. We can handle it." I said, "I know you can." "I want to," she said, "suit yourself." And we moved on to other things, and the conversation ended in the ordinary way our conversations ended. Without resolution, without warmth, without any of the things I had spent most of my life hoping might eventually appear between us. I drove to Simsbury that Saturday. The furnace needed a part replaced, which the repair company handled in under 2 hours. My grandfather and I ate soup at the kitchen table afterward, the good tomato kind, from the can that he heated on the stove, and he told me a story about buying his first piece of property in Bloomfield in 1968, a small mixed-use building, 2 retail units on the ground floor and 3 apartments above. He described the neighborhood, the cellar, the terms of the deal. I listened the way I always listened to him, fully, because he didn't repeat himself, and the details were always worth having. At one point, he got up and went to the study. He came back with a manila folder and set it on the table between us. "I want to ask you something," he said. He opened the folder. Inside were photographs and what looked like architectural drawings, commercial floor plans, older ones, hand-drafted, the kind I hadn't seen outside of school projects. He pushed one photograph toward me. It showed a 6-story brick building on a city block, the kind of solid mid-century construction that developers were always either tearing down or paying a premium to restore. "What do you think of it?" he said. I picked up the photograph, looked at the proportions, the window rhythm, the ground floor retail frontage. It was a good building. "Bones like that lasted. It's beautiful," I said. "Where is it?" He smiled. Not a big smile. The small one he used when he already knew the answer to something and was waiting to see if you'd get there on your own. "Hartford," he said. "Downtown." He didn't say anything else that afternoon. He closed the folder, put it back in the study, and when I left, he walked me to my car the way he always did, slow and deliberate, and held my hand for a moment before I got in. I drove home thinking about the building, about the floor plans, about the way he had looked at me when I said it was beautiful. I didn't understand it yet, but I felt the shape of something coming, the way you sometimes feel a change in pressure before a storm. Quiet, certain, already in motion. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of December. I was in my car, parked outside a hardware store in Wethersfield, engines still running, making a list on my phone of tile samples I needed to order for the Glastonbury project. It was cold enough that the windows had fogged slightly at the edges, and the radio was playing something low that I wasn't really listening to. An ordinary morning. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The number was a Hartford area code I didn't recognize. I answered anyway. The man on the other end introduced himself as Martin Collier and said he was an attorney with Collier and Associates on Trumbull Street. He said he represented Henry Parker in certain private estate matters. He said he was calling as a courtesy to confirm that a transfer of title recorded 18 months prior remained current and undisputed in the land records. I turned the radio off. "I'm sorry," I said. "A transfer of what?" Martin Collier was the kind of attorney who spoke precisely and without embellishment. He said that Henry Parker had, 18 months ago, executed a deed transferring ownership of a commercial property located at 412 Trumbull Street in Hartford, Connecticut, to Cassandra Marie Parker. He said the transfer had been properly recorded with the Hartford town clerk. He said Henry had instructed him to make this confirming call before the holidays, to ensure I was aware of the situation before certain family gatherings took place. I sat in my parked car outside the hardware store and did not speak for several seconds. I own a building, I said. You have owned it for 18 months, Martin Collier said. Yes, the building in the photograph. The 6-story brick on the downtown block with the good bones and the hand-drafted floor plans. The one my grandfather had slid across the kitchen table and asked me what I thought of it, his small smile already knowing something I didn't. I asked Martin Collier to tell me more. He did. He was thorough. He had clearly prepared for this call. 412 Trumbull Street was a 6-story commercial building constructed in 1959, fully renovated in 2014. Approximately 24,000 square feet total. Ground floor occupied by a regional insurance office on a long-term lease. Floors 2 through 4 leased to a mid-sized accounting firm. Floors 5 and 6 partially occupied, one unit currently generating income, one recently vacated but with an incoming tenant whose lease was set to begin February 1st. Total monthly rental income at full occupancy, $28,400. I wrote nothing down. I didn't need to. Every number landed in me with a clean, specific weight. Martin Collier said the property had been assessed at $4.2 million in the most recent municipal assessment. He said there was no mortgage. Henry Parker had owned it outright since 1987 and had paid off the note 11 years early. He said property taxes were current and that the building had a management company handling day-to-day tenant relations, a firm called Northeastern Property Services, with whom I was welcome to schedule an introduction at my convenience. He said Henry had been very clear about one thing. The transfer was a gift freely given, with no conditions attached. It was not a loan. It was not contingent on anything. It was mine. I asked why my grandfather had waited 18 months to tell me. Martin Collier paused in the measured way that told me he was choosing his words. Mr. Parker wanted to observe how certain family dynamics developed, he said. He wanted to be certain the gift was going to the right person and that the timing was appropriate. He asked me to make this call before Christmas, specifically. I understood what he meant without needing him to spell it out. My grandfather had watched. He had watched my parents push me to the edges of every room. He had watched the Thanksgiving announcement. He had possibly known about the document Jeffrey Marsh had sent me, the 11 pages with the $15,000 offer, and the 2 uses of the word straightforward. He had been paying attention for a very long time, quietly, from his farmhouse in Simsbury. While everyone assumed he had simply faded into retirement, he had not faded. He had been deciding. After I hung up with Martin Collier, I stayed in the parked car for a long time. The hardware store was right there. People walked in and out with bags and flat carts. A woman loaded lumber into the back of a pickup truck. The ordinary world continued doing its ordinary things, completely indifferent to the fact that my entire situation had just changed shape. I thought about my apartment. My 1-bedroom in Wethersfield with the good light in the morning and the radiator that clicked at night. I paid $1.340 a month and I paid it on time every month. I was proud of that in the quiet way you are proud of things you don't tell people about. And now I owned a building that generated $28,400 a month. I thought about the document sitting unsigned in my email. The 11 pages. The $15,000 and the word straightforward. I thought about my mother standing in her kitchen measuring coffee, not looking at me, saying same result. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I sat in my car until the engine had warmed the interior completely, and then I went into the hardware store and ordered my tile samples because I had a job to do and the Glastonbury clients were expecting an update by Friday. But something had settled in me. The way a foundation settles, not dramatically, not with noise, but permanently. The ground shifts and then it holds, and after that the thing built on top of it doesn't move. I drove to Simsbury 3 days later. My grandfather was in the kitchen when I arrived. Tin of shortbread on the counter, chair already pulled out. He looked up when I came through the door, and his eyes asked the question before his mouth did. Martin Collier called me, I said. Henry Parker nodded once, slowly. I sat down across from him. The shortbread tin was between us. Outside the kitchen window the yard was gray and still, the grass gone dormant, the old maple bare. Why me? I said. Not resentfully, I genuinely wanted to understand. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because you showed up. Every time." Without being asked, and without expecting anything for it, he picked up his coffee cup. "That building has been in my name for 37 years. I wanted it to go somewhere it would be respected." I looked at my hands on the table. I was 32 years old, and my grandfather had just handed me the most significant thing anyone had ever given me, and he had done it in the most Henry Parker way possible, quietly, practically, without ceremony. Over shortbread cookies in a farmhouse kitchen. "Christmas dinner," he said after a while. "Come to your parents' house. I'll be there." I looked up at him. "Wear something nice," he said, and there was that small smile again. I drove home knowing that something was coming. I didn't know the exact shape of it yet. But I knew my grandfather, and I knew that when Henry Parker told you to wear something nice, he was not talking about the dress code. The email from Jeffrey Marsh arrived again on a Friday, exactly 1 week before Christmas. Not a new email, a follow-up, same subject line, same professional tone, but this time with a deadline attached. Mr. Marsh wrote that Richard and Diane Parker had asked him to follow up regarding the documents sent on December 2nd, and that they would appreciate a response by December 23rd. He wrote that this was a simple matter and that delay served no one's interests. He used the word simple the way he had used straightforward the first time, as a small pressure disguised as a courtesy. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Claire Oduya with a note that said, "Another one. I'm still not signing. Just keeping you informed." Claire wrote back within the hour. "Good, don't." I went back to work, but the email sat in my mind the way certain things do, not loudly, not with urgency, just present. A low hum. I thought about what it meant that my parents had put a deadline on it. December 23rd was 2 days before Christmas. They wanted this resolved before the family gathered. They wanted my signature in hand before they sat down at that table, before the good china came out, and the candles were lit, and the family assembled in the way my mother had arranged families her entire adult life. With everyone in their correct position, filling their correct role, confirming the story she had decided to tell about the Parkers. They wanted me legally outside before Christmas dinner. I found that clarifying, actually. There is something almost useful about knowing exactly where you stand. On Saturday, my mother called. I answered because I always answered. Even then, even after everything, some habits are older than decisions. She asked if I had reviewed the document. I said I had. She asked if I had questions. I said I was looking into it. There was a pause. The particular pause my mother used when she was rearranging her approach. Then she said, "Cassandra, this isn't personal." I was standing at my kitchen counter, still in my coat from coming back from a client meeting. I looked at the middle distance and said nothing. "Your father and I have put 30 years into Parker Group," she continued. "We need the succession to be clean. This is about protecting what we've built. Brandon is the one who's been there. He understands the business. I know he does," I said. "So you understand why this makes sense. I understand what you're asking," I said. Another pause. "There's a provision for you," she said. "It's not nothing. $15,000. Not nothing. Technically, a number designed to feel like generosity while functioning as dismissal." I wondered if she knew how precisely that figure communicated what she thought I was worth. I suspected she did not. I suspected she had told Jeffrey Marsh to put in a number that looked reasonable on paper and had not thought much beyond that. "I'll be in touch before the 23rd, I said. She said, "Good." She sounded relieved. She had read that as movement toward yes. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a moment. Then I called Martin Collier. I asked him one question. Was there anything about the title transfer of 412 Trumbull Street that could be affected, challenged, or complicated by my signing a disclaimer of Parker Group assets? Martin Collier said no. The Trumbull Street property had never been part of Parker Group. It had never been part of the family trust. It was a private asset held solely in Henry Parker's name, transferred directly to me by deed, completely outside any instrument my parents had ever held or could now contest. I thanked him and hung up. Then I thought about my parents' plan. The succession they were so carefully constructing. The clean lines of inheritance they were drawing with Jeffrey Marsh's help. Parker Group was going to Brandon. The developments, the contracts, the client relationships, the name on the buildings. And Diane and Richard would watch it happen from a position of well-managed retirement, the founders who had passed the torch, the family story ending neatly the way they had written it. What they did not know was that Parker Group had been planning to expand. I knew this because Brandon had mentioned it at Thanksgiving, briefly, to my father, in the way he mentioned business things, casually, as though I wasn't in the room. He had said something about a building on Trumbull Street that Richard thought might come available. A six-story brick they'd had their eye on for a while. Good location for a second Hartford office, right in the downtown corridor they were targeting. He had said it like it was already half decided. I had been standing in the kitchen doorway, refilling my water glass. I had not reacted because I had not known yet. The call from Martin Collier had come 3 weeks later. Now I sat with both pieces of information at once and understood what my grandfather had seen from his farmhouse in Simsbury. He had known about Parker Group's expansion plans. He had known about the Trumbull Street building's location relative to what his son wanted. And 18 months ago, quietly, without drama, he had signed his name on a deed and given it to the granddaughter nobody was watching. That was Henry Parker. He didn't argue. He didn't confront. He arranged things carefully and then he waited. I had learned that from him. I just hadn't known until now that I was inside the arrangement. The week before Christmas moved slowly. I finished the Glastonbury project. I met with Northeastern Property Services about the Trumbull Street building. A practical call, nothing dramatic, just introduction and a review of current leases and maintenance schedules. The property manager, a calm woman named Susan, walked me through everything with the efficiency of someone who had managed buildings for 20 years and had no particular feelings about who the owner was. She handed me a folder. She showed me the rent roll. She explained the February tenant on floors 5 and 6. I walked through the building afterward, alone, Susan having handed me the access card without ceremony. 6 floors. The elevator was new, installed in the 2014 renovation. The hallways on the upper floors were quiet and smelled like commercial carpet and forced air heat. The ground floor insurance office had holiday decorations on the glass, paper snowflakes, a small wreath on the door. The accounting firm on the second floor had a reception desk with a poinsettia. I stood at the window on the 6th floor and looked out at downtown Hartford, the gold dome of the state capitol in the distance, the winter sky flat and white above the buildings. I had not been to a therapist in 2 years, but I thought about what she used to say about the difference between waiting for someone to recognize you and building something they have to reckon with. She had said it as a therapeutic observation. I had filed it away without fully understanding it. Standing on the 6th floor of 412 Trumbull Street, I understood it. 3 days before Christmas, my mother sent a follow-up text. Just 4 words. Have you decided yet? I looked at the text for a long moment. Then I typed back. See you at Christmas. She would read that as deflection. She would arrive at the dinner table still expecting my signature. She would have told my father and probably Brandon that it was nearly handled. That Cassandra was difficult but would come around, that she always did. She was not wrong that I had come around in the past. But the past was a different country, and I didn't live there anymore. The group text arrived on the 21st of December, 2 days before Christmas Eve. It was a thread my mother had created for what she called holiday logistics, a chain that included my father, Brandon, my aunt and Uncle Gerald, 2 of my parents' couple friends who came every year, and various cousins. 14 people total, which was exactly the number of place cards my mother would write in her careful handwriting. My name was not on the thread. I found out because my cousin Leah, who was 26 and the only person in the extended family I genuinely liked, screenshotted it and sent it to me directly with a single question mark. I looked at the screenshot. It was a message from my mother with the dinner time, parking instructions, and a note about what to bring. Standard logistics. My name was not missing by accident. The thread had been assembled contact by contact, and I had been left out deliberately. I texted Leah back, "Thanks for telling me. I'll be there." She sent a thumbs up, and then, after a pause, a small red heart. Leah was like that. She didn't say much, but she paid attention. Brandon's text came the following morning. December 22nd. I was eating breakfast, eggs, the radio on low, a gray Tuesday morning outside my window, when the notification came through. I picked up the phone expecting something practical, a question about parking or whether I was bringing anything. What he wrote was, "Hey, Mom mentioned the document situation is still unresolved. She's stressed about it. Can you just sign the thing? It's not a big deal, and it would really help everyone move forward. Also, honestly, it might be better if you skip dinner this year. Things are kind of tense, and you being there usually makes it worse. Just a thought." I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and ate the rest of my eggs, just a thought. Brandon had always delivered his cruelties with that phrase attached, as though the casual framing neutralized the content. Just a thought, as if suggesting I absent myself from my own family's Christmas dinner was the same category of thing as suggesting a different brand of coffee. I did not respond. I finished breakfast. I washed the plate and the pan. I got dressed. And then I did something I had been putting off for 2 days. I called Martin Collier and asked him to prepare a one-page summary of the Trumbull Street deed and current property status. Something clean and readable, suitable for passing across a dinner table if it came to that. Martin Collier said he would have it ready by end of day. Then I called Claire Oduya and told her I would not be signing the document from Jeffrey Marsh. She said I assumed as much. Do you want me to communicate that formally? I said yes. I asked her to send a letter to Jeffrey Marsh's office, professional and brief, stating that I had reviewed the document with counsel and had decided not to execute it. No explanation beyond that. No softening language. She said she would send it that afternoon. I hung up and stood at my apartment window for a moment, looking at the street below. A woman was walking a dog, a big one, some kind of shepherd mix, and the dog kept stopping to investigate things on the sidewalk, with the kind of total absorption that only animals and small children can manage. I watched them until they turned the corner. I thought about Brandon's text, the casual surgery of it. Things are kind of tense, and you being there usually makes it worse. I had spent 32 years being the problem in that family's narrative, the one who complicated things, who made choices nobody understood, who showed up at the wrong angle. I had internalized enough of that story, at various points in my life, that it had cost me real time and real energy to unlearn it. And here was Brandon, the night before Christmas Eve, trying to install it again in a text message. I thought about what my grandfather had said in his kitchen over shortbread. You showed up. Every time. Without being asked, and without expecting anything for it. I drove to Simsbury that afternoon. Henry was in better shape than I expected. He had gotten some color back, was moving around the kitchen with more ease than the last visit. He had a pot of soup stove and the radio on the counter playing Christmas music, the old kind, Nat King Cole and Bing Crosby. The songs that sounded like they had been recorded in a room with wood paneling and good whiskey. I told him about Brandon's text. Not to complain, just to inform. The way I always informed Henry because he liked having the full picture. He listened without interrupting. He stirred the soup once, then he said, "Is that so?" Not a question, a statement. The particular kind that meant he was filing the information in a place he already had prepared for it. Are you still coming tomorrow? I asked. I'll be there, he said. Gerald is picking me up at 4. I nodded. We ate soup at the kitchen table. The Nat King Cole song on the radio was the Christmas song. Chestnuts and open fires, and outside the kitchen window, the first real snow of the season had started. Not heavy, just the early quiet kind, the flakes big and slow. Coming straight down in the still air, Grandpa, I said. What are you going to do tomorrow? He looked at me over his soup bowl, with those eyes that had seen enough that they didn't need to be wide. I'm going to have Christmas dinner with my family, he said. And I'm going to give my granddaughter a key. I looked at him. In front of everyone. In front of everyone. He said there was something in the way he said it, quiet, certain, already decided, that made the back of my throat tighten for just a moment. I pressed it down. I was not going to cry at my grandfather's kitchen table over soup, no matter how much the moment deserved it. They're going to have questions, I said. Yes, he said, they are. And the letter from Claire Oduya gets to Jeffrey Marsh tomorrow morning. He nodded slowly. He had known about Claire Oduya. Of course he had. I helped him with the dishes afterward. We didn't talk much. We had never needed to fill silence with each other, which was one of the things I loved most about being in his company. I dried the bowls and put them back in the cabinet, and the snow kept coming down outside, and the radio played on. When I left, he walked me to the door. Cassandra, he said, before I stepped out. I turned. Don't let them make you small tomorrow, he said. You haven't been small for a long time. They just haven't been paying attention. I drove home in the snow with the heat on, and my hands steady on the wheel. The roads were quiet and white-edged, the streetlights catching the flakes as they came down. I thought about the dinner table tomorrow. The good china. The place card my mother would have written in her careful handwriting, if she wrote one for me at all. I thought about 14 people in a room and a key in an old man's pocket. I thought about a building on Trumbull Street with its lights on, its tenants going about their business, its deed with my name on it sitting recorded and undisputed in the Hartford land records. I was ready. What I did not know, what I could not have prepared for, was exactly how far my mother was willing to go before it was over. Christmas Eve morning arrived gray and cold, the sky the flat white of a sky that has already made up its mind about the weather. I woke at 7, made coffee, sat at my kitchen table with the mug between my hands and the apartment quiet around me. Outside the window, the street was dusted from last night's snow. Not much, just enough to coat the parked cars and the edges of the sidewalk in something clean and temporary. By afternoon, it would be gray slush, but for now it was still. I had slept better than I expected. Martin Collier's IPE document had arrived by email the previous evening, as promised. One page, clean and professional. Property address, legal description, date of deed transfer, my name as current owner of record, current assessed value, and a brief note on the existing lease structure. The kind of document that answered every relevant question without editorializing. I had printed 2 copies on my home printer and folded them into a plain white envelope that now sat on my kitchen counter next to my keys. I looked at the envelope while I drank my coffee. I thought about whether to bring it. I had not decided yet, not entirely. Bringing it meant anticipating a confrontation. It meant walking into my parents' house, already prepared, for the moment things went sideways, which was a particular kind of premeditation I had never been comfortable with. I had spent my whole life trying not to be the one who caused scenes, the one who created problems. Even when the problems already existed, and I was simply the person standing in them. But I thought about what Henry had said. You haven't been small for a long time. They just haven't been paying attention. I picked up the envelope and put it in my bag. Then I got dressed and drove 40 minutes to Simsbury because it was Christmas Eve morning, and my grandfather was 84, and I was not going to let him spend it alone. He was already up when I arrived. He had made his own coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table in a pressed shirt, reading glasses on, working through the Hartford Courant the way he did every morning. He looked up when I knocked and let myself in. You didn't have to come, he said. I know, I said. I hung up my coat and sat down across from him. I wanted to. He folded the paper. We sat together for a couple of hours, talking about nothing urgent, a documentary he had watched about the Connecticut River. A contractor he had used on a building project in the 1990s that he'd run into recently at the pharmacy, a book he was partway through. The ordinary texture of his days, which I had always found steadying. At some point he went to his study and came back with something in his hand. A key. Old-fashioned, not large, the kind cut for a commercial door lock from an earlier era. He set it on the kitchen table between us. I looked at it. I've had a copy made, he said. There's a modern fob card for the building entry system. Susan at Northeastern has yours. But I wanted you to have the original. He paused. I've had it since 1987. The day I paid off the note, I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Solid brass, worn smooth in places from 37 years of handling. The kind of object that had been held so many times it had absorbed something of the person who carried it. I'm going to give it to you at dinner tonight, he said. I looked up at him. I know you have the deed, he said. I know Martin called you, but I want to do this in front of them. Not to humiliate anyone, he said this carefully, and I believed him. But because some things need witnesses. Your mother and father have been telling a story about you for 30 years. I want the record corrected. In front of people, I held the key in my palm. It sat there, small and warm from his hand. They're going to be angry, I said. Yes, he said. Dad might try to dispute it. He can try, Henry said. Martin has been in practice for 31 years. The deed was recorded properly. There is nothing to dispute. I closed my fingers around the key. Here is what I had not told my grandfather, and what I want you to understand, because it matters for what happened next. 3 days earlier, on the morning of December 22nd, at almost exactly the same time, Brandon was sending me his text, suggesting I skip Christmas. My parents had done something else. I found out about it from Leah. She had called me that evening, not texted, which told me it was something she didn't want in writing. She said she had been at my parents' house that afternoon, picking up a dish her mother had left there, and she had overheard my father on the phone in the study. The door was not fully closed. She had not been trying to listen. What she heard was my father telling someone. She thought it was Jeffrey Marsh, that if Cassandra did not sign by the 23rd, they should explore whether Henry's transfer could be challenged on the basis of diminished capacity. that Henry was 84, that there might be an argument. Leah's voice when she told me this was careful and apologetic, as though she was delivering something she wished she didn't have to. I thanked her. I told her I was fine. I hung up and sat very still for approximately 4 minutes. Then I called Martin Collier. I told him what Leah had heard. I asked him directly, was there any basis for a diminished capacity challenge to the deed transfer? Martin Collier did not hesitate. He said Henry Parker had been assessed by his physician at the time of the transfer and found to be fully competent. He said the deed had been witnessed and notarized. He said Henry had provided a written statement of intent at the time, which Martin had in his files. He said any challenge on those grounds would be not just unsuccessful, but given the documentation, almost certainly dismissed before it reached a courtroom. He also said, carefully, that if Richard Parker pursued such a challenge, it would constitute a legal action against his own father. I said I understood. Martin said he would prepare an additional document, a one-page summary of the competency documentation, and add it to the envelope he was already preparing for me, just in case. I had picked up that envelope from his office on the morning of December 23rd. It was now in my bag next to Martin's summary, 2 pages, folded into a plain white envelope that I had carried through Christmas Eve morning without telling my grandfather about, because he did not need to know that his son had considered calling his mental fitness into question in order to take back a building he had never known existed. Some things you protect people from knowing, even people who are strong. I sat at Henry's kitchen table on Christmas Eve morning and held his key in my hand and said none of this. I just nodded and told him I would be there tonight, that I would sit where my mother put me, and I would be patient and I would wait for his cue. He looked at me for a moment with those quiet eyes. You're ready, he said. It was not a question. Yes, I said. He picked up his coffee. Outside the kitchen window, the sky had gone from white to the particular pale blue that sometimes appeared in Connecticut in winter, unexpectedly, between weather systems, the kind of light that made everything look briefly clarified. The bare maple in the yard. The snow still clean on the ground. I thought about my parents' house that evening. The 14 place cards, the good china, the candles my mother would have spent 20 minutes arranging. I thought about a key that had been held for 37 years by a man who paid off a note early and asked nothing of anyone and watched everything. I thought about a document in a drawer in Jeffrey Marsh's office that was about to become irrelevant in a way its author had not anticipated. I thought about Brandon's tech. Things are kind of tense, and you being there usually makes it worse. I turned the key over once in my hand. Then I put it in my coat pocket, where I could feel its weight for the rest of the day. Tonight, everything my parents had been building toward their careful, clean, legally documented version of the Parker family's future was going to meet the version my grandfather had been quietly constructing for 18 months. One of them was recorded with the Hartford town clerk. The other one was not. My mother had seated me at the far end of the table again. I found my place card, Cassandra, in her careful handwriting, the same looping C she had used my entire life, positioned at the corner nearest the kitchen, beside my Uncle Gerald's wife Patricia, away from the centerpieces, away from the good light of the chandelier, in the seat that caught the draft when someone opened the swinging door. I recognized the geography of it immediately. She had thought about where to put me. She had decided this was the right answer. I set my coat over the chair and went to help carry things from the kitchen. The house looked the way it always looked at Christmas. My mother had a talent for rooms. I had inherited that from her, actually, though neither of us had ever acknowledged it. The tree in the front window was 10 feet tall, white lights only, ornaments in gold and ivory. The mantel had fresh greenery and tapered candles in brass holders. The dining table had been extended to its full length, 14 chairs, the white cloth pressed without a single crease, the good china set at each place with the precision of someone who found order genuinely comforting. It was a beautiful room. I had always thought so. By 5:30 most people had arrived. My Uncle Gerald and Patricia, two of my parents' couple friends, the Hendersons and the Winthrops. Various cousins including Leah, who caught my eye when I came in and gave me a look I understood. She was nervous on my behalf, which was kind of her. Brandon arrived at 5:45 with a bottle of wine and a girlfriend I hadn't met before, a tall woman named Kristen, who shook my hand with the polished confidence of someone who had been briefed on the family in advance. My father was in the living room, holding court, drink in hand, talking about a development project in Glastonbury. I noted the coincidence without commenting on it. My mother moved through the room in her element. She had on a deep green dress and her pearl earrings, and she managed the flow of people with the efficiency of someone who had hosted these dinners for 30 years. She greeted me when I came in with a kiss near my cheek and a hand briefly on my arm, perfunctory but present, and then moved on to the Hendersons without missing a step. She had not yet mentioned the document. She would. I knew her. She was saving it for after dinner, when the wine had done its work, and everyone was in the loose, generous mood of a meal that had gone well. She would pull me aside in the kitchen while I was helping clean up, and she would ask quietly, and she would have Jeffrey Marsh's number in her phone. My grandfather arrived at 6. Gerald had driven him, as planned. Henry came through the front door in a good wool coat, navy, one I hadn't seen before, which meant Patricia had probably helped him choose it, and the room shifted slightly the way rooms do when someone with a certain quality enters them. Not louder, the opposite. A brief collective awareness. My mother went to him immediately, both hands, kiss on the cheek. "Daddy, you look wonderful." My father crossed the room and shook his hand with both of his, the grip that men use when they mean to communicate respect. Brandon called out from across the room, "Grandpa," with the easy warmth of someone who knew they were the favorite. Henry accepted all of this with his usual equanimity. He shook hands. He allowed himself to be guided to the armchair in the corner near the fireplace, the good one, where someone had put a small side table with a glass of bourbon that my mother had clearly prepositioned because she knew his drink. He settled in, looked around the room, and his eyes found mine across the space. I was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He gave me a small nod. I nodded back. Dinner was served at 6:30. I sat at my end of the table and ate and talked to Patricia, who was on a new Peloton program and had developed opinions about recovery days, and to my cousin Daniel on my other side, who was 29 and working in Boston and had the comfortable self-absorption of someone whose family had never put him in the corner seat. The food was good. My mother was an excellent cook in the way she was excellent at most domestic things. Precisely and without waste, Brandon made a toast. He thanked my parents for everything they had given the family. He mentioned Parker Group. He said the word legacy twice. My father's eyes were bright. My mother dabbed the corner of her eye with her napkin, the same performance as Thanksgiving, the same tears she kept carefully in reserve. I raised my glass with everyone else. I ate my dinner. The table was in the soft, satiated quiet of a meal nearing its end when my grandfather stood up. He did not tap a glass. He did not clear his throat. He simply placed both hands on the table and pushed himself to standing. Slowly, and with the deliberateness of a man who had decided something and was not in a hurry about it. The table noticed because he was 84 and the physical effort of it was visible, and the room responded to that, the way rooms respond to age, with an instinctive, collective attention. My mother said, "Daddy, you don't have to. I'd like to say something." He said the table went quiet. Henry Parker looked around at 14 people with the unhurried gaze of a man who had been watching all of them for a very long time. He did not look nervous. He did not look frail. He looked, in that moment, like the person who had built something from a $6,000 loan and a handshake in 1971, and had been quietly keeping track ever since. He said, "I've been coming to this table for 40 years. And there is something I should have said out loud a long time ago." The room was very still. The candles did not move. He looked at me, and then he walked toward me, not toward Brandon, not toward my father. He pushed his chair back from the table with one hand and walked the length of the room, past the centerpieces and the good china and the 14 faces turning to follow him, and he stopped behind my chair. I looked up at him. He reached into the inside pocket of his navy wool coat and took out the key. He held it for a moment between his fingers, the old brass key, worn smooth from 37 years, and then he set it on the table in front of me. Then he reached into his breast pocket and removed a small white envelope and placed it beside the key. He put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, in a voice that was quiet but carried to every corner of the room, "This belongs to you, Cassandra." It always should have. The table did not move. Patricia inhaled audibly. Leah's hands were flat on the tablecloth. The Henderson couple looked at each other. Brandon was very still, his wine glass partway to his mouth and not moving. My father said, "Dad, what is this?" My grandfather did not look at my father. He looked at me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. The one-page summary Martin Collier had prepared: property address, legal description, Deed transfer date, assessed value $4.2 million. My name Cassandra Marie Parker, listed as owner of record. I set it flat on the table so the numbers faced up. I did not say anything. I didn't need to. My mother saw the numbers first. I watched it happen. Her eyes moved to the paper, read the figure, and something in her face went through several expressions in the space of 2 seconds, none of which she had planned for. She said, What is that? My grandfather said, a building on Trumbull Street. I've owned it since 1987, he said it simply, the way he said all the important things. I transferred it to Cassandra 18 months ago. It's hers. The silence that followed was the particular kind that comes not from absence of sound, but from the presence of something that has restructured the room. My father stood up. His chair scraped back. He said, Dad, you never told me about a building on Trumbull. No, Henry said. I didn't. My father stopped. He looked at the paper on the table, at the assessed value, at my name. Something moved through his face that I had never seen there before. Not anger yet. Something prior to anger. The expression of a person who has just discovered the map they have been using was wrong. Brandon said, Trumbull Street. His voice was flat. That's the block He stopped. Yes, I thought. That's the block. My mother turned to me. She had composed herself partially, which was impressive given the circumstances. She said, Cassandra, I don't know what your grandfather has told you, but this is something we need to discuss as a family. I agree, I said. Then I reached into my bag. I took out the envelope from Martin Collier's office. The second one. The one I had not told my grandfather about, and I unfolded it on the table beside the first document. The competency assessment summary. Dr. Reeves's signature. The date. 18 months ago, the same week as the deed transfer. Henry Parker. Found fully competent. The notarized statement of intent. Martin Collier's cover note. I looked at my father. I said very quietly, I spoke with Martin Collier. He told me about the documentation he prepared at the time of the transfer. I paused. All of it. My father's face did something I had never seen it do. The blood left it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, the way color leaves something left out in the cold. Brandon put his wine glass down on the table. My mother looked at my father. My father did not look back at her. He was looking at the second document, at the physician's signature, at the notarized statement, and I watched him understand what it meant. Not just that the transfer was unassailable, but that the argument he had considered making had been prepared against. That someone had known, and had documented, and had been ready. My grandfather's hand was still on my shoulder. He said nothing more. He had said what he came to say. The rest of it, the papers, the numbers, the expressions traveling around the table like weather, he watched with the calm of a man who had arranged things carefully and was now simply observing them come to rest. Leah made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. Patricia was looking at her husband. The Henderson couple had the frozen quality of people at a dinner party who have wandered into something they have no framework for. My father sat back down, slowly. Without being asked, the candles burned. The Christmas tree lights in the front window blinked on. The room smelled of pine and roast, and the particular warmth of a house full of people, and somewhere under all of it, very quiet. The old year was already ending. The first person to speak after my father sat back down was Brandon. He had been quiet for almost 2 full minutes, which was unusual for him. Brandon was not a person who tolerated silence. He filled it instinctively, reflexively, the way some people fill empty wall space, with anything that fits. But he had been sitting with his wine glass on the table, and his eyes moving between the 2 documents and our grandfather's hand on my shoulder. And something in him had been working through something he didn't have a prepared answer for. He said, the Trumbull Street building. He said it slowly, like he was testing the words. Dad has been looking at that block for 18 months, my father said. Brandon looked at him. We've had it flagged. You told me it might come available. We talked about it in October. Brandon, stop. I'm just saying. He looked at me. His face had the quality of someone who had walked into a room, expecting furniture to be in one place, and found it somewhere else entirely. You knew about this? You've known this whole time? I found out 3 weeks ago, I said. But Grandpa, he looked at Henry. You've had this building for 30 years and you never told Dad? My grandfather said it was mine to do with as I chose. Brandon opened his mouth, closed it. The girlfriend, Kristen, had her hands in her lap and was looking at the centerpiece with the focused attention of someone who has correctly identified that the least dangerous place to look is at the flowers. My mother had not spoken since I put the second document on the table. She was sitting very straight in her chair at the head of the table. She always took the head. My father took the foot. The symmetry of their authority. And she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen her direct at me before. It was not anger, though there was anger in it. It was something more unsettling. It was the expression of a person recalibrating. Then she looked at my father. Something passed between them in that look. The wordless communication of a long marriage, the kind that has its own shorthand. I watched my father receive whatever she was communicating, and I watched him straighten slightly in his chair. He said, "I'd like to call Jeffrey." My mother said, "Richard, just to understand the situation clearly," he said. He was using his business voice now, the controlled one, the voice that had managed contractors and zoning boards, and 30 years of difficult conversations. He was reassembling himself in real time. "I'm not suggesting anything. I just want to make sure we understand what we're dealing with." He took out his phone. I said, "You can call him. But I've spoken with Martin Collier about the transfer documentation, including the physician's assessment from the date of transfer." I touched the second document lightly with one finger, and about the basis for any potential challenge. The table was very quiet. My father looked at me across 14 place settings and 2 centerpieces, and 32 years of a particular kind of distance. And I watched him understand that I had been to a lawyer before this dinner. That I had not come unprepared. That the daughter he had stopped asking about at her 28th birthday had spent the last 3 weeks being thorough. He put his phone down on the table. "My Uncle Gerald said quietly, to no one in particular, good Lord, Patricia," said Gerald. In the reflexive way wives say their husbands' names when they want them to stop, my mother stood up. She did not knock anything over. She was too composed for that. She pushed her chair back and stood with both hands on the table, and she looked at my grandfather. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than I expected, which made it more devastating than if she had raised it. "You could have told us," she said. 30 years, Daddy. You could have said something." Henry looked at his daughter-in-law. He had known her for 35 years. He had watched her manage his son's household and his son's company parties and his son's children with the efficiency of someone who believed that management and love were the same thing. He had, I think, understood her in ways she had never suspected. He said, "I watched for a long time, Diane. I watched what happened at this table." He did not raise his voice either. "I watched who asked Cassandra about her work and who didn't. I watched where she was seated. I watched the Thanksgiving before last when she brought her portfolio to show the family and you left the room before she finished." He paused. "I watched." My mother's jaw tightened. "I'm not angry with you," he said. And he meant it. That was the thing about Henry Parker. He did not carry anger the way other people did. But I had something of value, and I chose where to put it. That is all. My mother sat back down. Not with defeat. She was not a person who sat down in defeat, but with the particular posture of someone who has encountered an argument they cannot dismantle tonight and knows it. Brandon said, "So the expansion," he stopped. Looked at my father. "The site we identified," my father said, "not now, but if she owns the building on Trumbull." Brandon. My father's voice had an edge in it that was not usually directed at Brandon, and Brandon felt it. He stopped talking. The room was doing something strange. The Hendersons were very still. Leah had her hands around her wineglass and was looking at the tablecloth. The cousins, who had no context for any of this, were doing the polite thing, which was looking at their plates. Gerald was looking at his father-in-law with an expression that might have been admiration. And then Brandon's girlfriend Kristen, who had been a model of restraint for the past 10 minutes, looked at Brandon and said, in a voice that was entirely too audible for the moment, "Wait, so you've been trying to buy a building that your grandfather already gave to your sister?" Brandon said, "She's not my. We're not. It's complicated." Kristen looked around the table and then back at her wineglass and said, "Okay," in the specific tone of a woman revising her understanding of a family she had agreed to spend Christmas with. And then something happened that I had not planned for and could not have predicted. My father's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes. He silenced it. But the name on the screen had been visible to my mother, who was seated beside him, and I watched her see it. She said, "That's Jeffrey," he said. "I'll call him back," she said. "You called him already." The words were quiet. But the table heard them, and what they communicated to everyone present. To 14 people eating Christmas dinner in a room with 10-foot ceilings and 2 centerpieces, was that my father had stepped away at some point during the meal, before the documents were on the table, and had made a call. My grandfather looked at his son, my father met his eyes. And whatever passed between them in that moment. Between an 84-year-old man who had built things with his hands and paid off notes early, and carried a key for 37 years, and his son who had received all of that, and somewhere along the way had decided the map was his to redraw, lasted only a few seconds. My father looked away first. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He picked up his water glass. He drank from it slowly and set it back down, and he was very controlled about all of it, in the way he was always controlled, except that his hand was not entirely steady when he put the glass back on the tablecloth. I saw it. My grandfather saw it. I don't know who else did. My mother pressed her fingers briefly to her temple. It was the only crack. A small gesture, private, the kind you make when something has given you a headache and you're trying to decide whether to acknowledge it. Then she looked at me, not at my grandfather, not at my father, at me, and she said, "Cassandra, just my name, nothing attached to it." The way she might have said it when I was small, before the distance between us had been built up brick by brick until it was too high to see over. I looked at her. She did not say anything else. I don't know what she would have said if she had continued. I don't know if it would have been an apology or a negotiation or something else entirely, because Gerald chose that moment to reach across the table and pick up the property summary and put his reading glasses on. And he said quietly, 4.2 million. Good Lord. And Patricia said, Gerald again, and the spell broke. Brandon pushed his chair back from the table. He did not slam it. He was too measured for that. He stood, and he said to no one in particular that he needed some air. And he walked through the living room and opened the front door and went outside into the December night. And Kristen looked at his empty chair for a moment and then reached for her wine glass. My grandfather eased himself back into his chair at the table. Someone, I think it was Leah, quietly refilled his water glass. I looked at the key on the table in front of me. Old brass, worn smooth, 37 years of a man who had paid attention. I picked it up and held it in my hand. The candles burned. The table sat in the particular silence of people who have witnessed something and are not yet sure how to return to ordinary conversation. Outside, through the front window, I could see the Christmas tree lights blinking on in their slow, even rhythm. And beyond them, through the glass, Brandon's outline on the porch, hands in his pockets, standing in the cold. The Christmas dinner did not end the way my mother had planned. There was no clean conclusion, no tidy resolution, no moment where everyone gathered their coats in good spirits and said their goodbyes at the door. What happened instead was the slow, awkward deflation of a gathering that has been structurally altered midway through. People finishing their wine with a little more focus than usual, conversations restarting in smaller clusters, the cousins drifting toward the living room, Gerald and Patricia making their exit with the efficiency of people who understood that their presence was now surplus to requirements. Leah hugged me at the door. She held on for a beat longer than a casual hug and said quietly, "Near my ear, I'm proud of you." I squeezed her hand and told her to drive safe. My grandfather left with Gerald at 8:30, as he always did. He put his coat on slowly, and I helped him with the buttons at the collar because his fingers were stiff in the cold. Before he went out the door, he held my face in both hands for a moment, his palms dry and warm, and looked at me the way he always looked at me, like I was something worth seeing. "Merry Christmas, Cassandra," he said. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," I said. I watched Gerald's car back out of the driveway and turn onto the street and disappear. Then I went back inside because my coat was in the closet and I still had to get through the end of the evening. Brandon had come back in from the cold after about 20 minutes. He and Kristen left shortly after, with brief goodbyes that carried the quality of an exit strategy. He did not speak to me directly. He shook my father's hand at the door, kissed my mother's cheek, and walked out with Kristen's hand in his. And I watched my mother watch him go with the expression of a woman who has just understood that a plan she had been building for years needs significant revision. My parents and I were alone in the kitchen by 9:15. I was helping with the dishes because I always helped with the dishes, even that night, even after everything. My father was wrapping leftovers at the counter. My mother was washing the good china by hand, which she always did herself, never trusted the dishwasher with it. The kitchen was warm and smelled of roast and dish soap and the lingering warmth of a meal that had fed 14 people. We worked in silence for a while. The particular silence of people who have said too much and not enough and are sorting through what comes next. My father spoke first. He said, without turning from the counter, I didn't know about the building. I said, I know. Your grandfather kept that entirely separate. He paused. 30 years. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was entitled to do that. It was his. He said it carefully, like a man reading from a document he had written himself. An acknowledgement, precisely worded, that did not concede more than was necessary. It was, coming from Richard Parker. Something close to a concession. I dried a serving dish and put it on the counter. My mother did not speak for a long time. She washed the plates one by one with the methodical focus she brought to tasks that required her hands to be busy while her mind was elsewhere. When she finally spoke, she was looking at the plate in her hands. She said, I saw you. At the Thanksgiving before last. When you brought the portfolio, I stopped drying. I did leave the room, she said. I knew I was leaving. I told myself it was because I needed to check on the coffee. She rinsed the plate. It wasn't because of the coffee. I stood at the counter and held the dish towel and did not say anything. I don't know how to explain it, she said. The choices you made, they frightened me. Because I didn't understand them, and I turned that into, she stopped. I turned it into something else. It was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in a decade, maybe longer. It was not an apology, not exactly, but it was something more valuable than an apology. It was an explanation offered without defense, which from Diane Parker was the harder thing. I said, I know. She looked up at me then. I said, I'm not asking you to understand every choice I made. I just needed to not be invisible. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, very slightly, and went back to the plate. We finished the dishes. My father said goodnight from the hallway, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent an evening revising his understanding of something he thought he had controlled. I got my coat from the closet. My mother walked me to the door. At the door she said, the document. From Jeffrey, I'm not signing it, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, all right, just that. All right, not agreement, not warmth. But the end of a particular fight, which was something. I drove home on the highway with the key in my coat pocket. The night was clear and cold, the stars out over Connecticut for the first time in days, the roads empty and dark between the bright intervals of the exit signs. I thought about my grandfather's hands on my face. I thought about a plate in my mother's hands, and an honest sentence, and the particular weight of words said late. I thought about a building on Trumbull Street with its lights off for the holiday, quiet and solid, its deed recorded and undisputed, waiting to become whatever I decided to make of it. In the months that followed, I did not rush. I met with Susan at Northeastern Property Services in January and reviewed the full lease structure. The incoming tenant on the 5th and 6th floors signed their agreement February 1st, as scheduled. A small law firm, 7 attorneys, a 3-year lease at $9,200 per month. Full occupancy, $28,400 coming in every month, clean and regular as clockwork. I gave notice on my Wethersfield apartment in March. I renovated the ground floor retail unit that came available in April, did the design work myself naturally, and moved my studio into it in June. Cassandra Parker Interiors. The sign read, in clean sans serif letters on the glass. My grandfather came to see it on a Tuesday afternoon in July. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the sign for a long moment, and then he looked at me and said, good, which was Henry Parker for a standing ovation. Parker Group's Trumbull Street expansion did not happen. I never raised it with them, and they never raised it with me. The subject existed between us, in the permanent past tense of things that were considered and then quietly abandoned. My father pivoted the expansion plan to a different block in the spring. I read about it in the Hartford Business Journal. Brandon lost the VP of Development role in September. I heard this from Leah, not from my parents. A commercial project in Glastonbury, not mine, a separate one, had gone significantly over budget under his oversight, and 2 anchor tenants had withdrawn. My father had restructured, which was a word that meant Brandon was now consulting rather than directing, which was a word that meant something else entirely. Leah said Brandon had taken it hard. I did not feel satisfaction exactly. I felt the particular neutrality of watching a consequence arrive that had always been on its way. My mother called me in October. She asked if I wanted to have lunch. Not at the house. She suggested a restaurant in West Hartford. A quiet French place I had always liked. I said yes. We sat across from each other at a table by the window, and we talked about ordinary things for most of the meal. Her garden, a project I had just finished, a book she was reading. Near the end, over coffee, she asked about the building. I told her about the law firm, the renovation, the studio. She listened. She asked follow-up questions. She did not leave the room. It was not a transformation. We were not suddenly the mother and daughter from a version of this story where everything resolves cleanly and the credits roll. We were two people who had spent 30 years building a particular distance between them and were now, cautiously, measuring how much of it could be crossed. But she listened, and I told her things, and she asked to see the studio sometime. I said yes. My grandfather spent Christmas with me that year. Just the two of us at my studio apartment above the office. A small tree in the corner, soup from the can he liked, Nat King Cole on the speaker. He brought shortbread cookies in the tin. I made the coffee. We sat at my kitchen table and talked about nothing urgent for 3 hours. It was the best Christmas I had ever had. If you have ever sat at a table where you were made to feel like the least important person in the room, I want you to hear this. The people who dismissed you were not seeing clearly. They were seeing a version of you, built from their own fears and their own limitations, and they called that version by your name, and over time it is possible to mistake it for yourself. You are not that version. The work you do quietly, without applause, without recognition, it is not invisible, it is being witnessed by someone. Maybe not the people you most want it to be, but someone is watching, someone is keeping an account. Build the thing anyway, show up anyway, drive the 40 minutes, eat the soup at the kitchen table, ask to see the floor plans, and when someone places a key in your hand in front of a room full of people who never thought to look at you, hold it. Hold it like the 37 years it took to get there. Because that weight is real. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. Hit like if you have ever been the one at the far end of the table. And subscribe, because there are more stories where this one came from, and I think you already know that some of them are yours too.